We're so delighted this evening to be opening Ecologues, which has had a long time coming, a 6-part series, conversation series about the climate crisis. And so really to introduce Ecologues and to introduce our partnership and our long-term planning, I'm going to hand over to Maria from Decoder, who will tell you a little bit more about the project.
Great, thank you, Alice. So my name is Maria Krasinski. I'm the managing director of Decoder, which is a Paris-based global news service for young people and an education platform. And what we do is help young people learn journalistic and media literacy skills that really help develop them as global citizens and learn about cross-cultural collaboration, communication, building empathy and understanding beyond their own borders. And a huge part of that, of course, is the climate crisis. And we know this is a huge topic among young people. We work with students all around the world. We have partnerships with 21 schools in 17 different countries. And time and again, climate is the #1 issue they want to write stories about, they want to investigate with. So last year, we launched a new project called The Writings on the Wall, funded by Erasmus, in partnership with the Climate Academy, based at the European School of Brussels, and headed by Matthew Pye, who we'll meet soon. And the grant project is really focused on helping young people combat climate change through journalism, activism, and art. And we've developed a series of climate education tutorials, really interactive activities that teachers can implement in their classroom, that students can bring to their schools, and really go beyond surface level actions against climate change to really focus on systems level change. How can we really make an impact? Who's doing something really significant, which we're going to get into more of today. And we are absolutely delighted to be working with the American Library in Paris on the webinar series. So the Writings on the Wall, or WOW, as we like to call it, has a series of ongoing activities. Every month, we publish stories by Decoder's roster of professional journalists, which we call Climate Decoders. We have a storytelling competition coming up with the deadline of March 1st, where young people can profile someone who's really moving the needle on climate change. We have a series of journalism training videos on our website, and the Ecologues series, which we're just kicking off now, the first of 6, and lots of great conversations to come. So thank you all for joining us. I'll turn it back to Alice.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please, to kick us all off? So tonight we're broaching the truly enormous question. It was almost kind of a pitch to get you in the room. What is the climate crisis? And to not really answer the question, but certainly to broach it, we have 3 highly qualified and brilliant speakers. In person, we have Matthew Pye, who, as Maria mentioned, founded the Climate Academy. He's a teacher, philosopher, and author. We have Rahmina Paulette, who is the founder of Kisumu Environmental Champs, an activist and a conservationist, and then joining us on Zoom and kind of hovering over the conversation like an all-knowing, benevolent watcher, we have Alister Doyle, who is the author of The Great Melt, and he formerly reported on the environment for Reuters for many, many years. And so we had a kind of conversation before we got started, and we thought that rather than tackle the question head on, although we will certainly do that for the first kind of 10 to 15 minutes, we thought, given the profiles of the people we have with us this evening, each person provides a kind of frame to understand the question. So we have the journalistic frame, we have the activist frame, and then we have a kind of educational frame. And so that is really what we'll be doing in conversation for about 45 minutes to even an hour. We have really nice kind of enormous 90 minutes tonight. And the idea is that seamlessly, after about 45 minutes to an hour, we'll open up to audience questions, and really that by the end of these 90 minutes, we'll be having a kind of group conversation as a community. And that's what's also so wonderful, I think, about Ecologues, is that this conversation will be an ongoing one over the course of 6 months, because of course it starts tonight in January, we'll have February, March, and so on until June, broaching different questions. So having said all of that, I'm going to turn over to Matthew, and who is going to present kind of the 6 graphs from your Essential Science downloadable brochure packet from your website. Because while it is true that what is the climate crisis is very overwhelming and kind of enormous and unanswerable, it's also true that there are responses and there are scientific responses. And I'm not alone, I think, in finding this a very compelling and useful resource. So over to you, Matthew, and if you have any questions or comments, Rahmina or Alister, please do jump in.
Okay, so thank you. And it's great to be here in a library. It's great library vibes. So I think the first thing to say as a teacher, and this will become apparent in the graphs, is that schools tend to do climate and environmental things on a individual basis. So individual problems, individual actions. And what's really missing in educational things about the crisis is a systems level view, as Maria rightly said. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that what tends to happen when things go global in a way is that then you lose track of the essential bits. So you kind of get swamped in incredible levels, dimensions, scientific research here, problems over there, and then the essential key data gets lost. So there's this tension exists between the details and the universal, and the Climate Academy, which I designed and from which this is an attempt to hold those two things out. When you need to look at the global picture, you hold it really clearly, and then when you need to go down to details, you have this systemic framework. So that's like the background. And I think we have the graphs. So in a way, these are like the key, this graph here with the red line that goes up. This is just to emphasize the fact that we are still emitting 42 gigatons of extra carbon every year. So no matter how many solar panels you see on the drive, when you drive on holiday or whatever, how many debates we have or whatever, we are still increasing and accelerating CO2 levels. So there is a systemic problem, and that's not often visible in the media. And yeah, next graph. When you hear about America has increased its solar panels by 1,000% or something, well, we're still basically 80% dependent on fossil fuels. So the fundamental infrastructure of our societies and our economies is still fueled by fossil fuels. And that's not something which an individual student can change. You have to have infrastructure change. So, for all the attention on, for students to eat less meat or fly less, and those things are important, but fundamentally, it will be solved at a systems level, and especially in the energy sector. So the third one, these are all the COP events. Rahmina was in the latest COP event in Egypt. And again, this is just to emphasize the fact that when you go to these COP meetings, what's not there, and this will become in later graphs, is a clear view of the carbon budget. So in the media, like Europe is committed to reduce emissions by 55% by the year 2050, according to 2030 by 1990 levels. And that's just meaningless. Again, if you think about it as a student, what does that mean? If I told Rahmina, studying English, if I was Rahmina's English teacher, and I told her, yeah, I think that in 5 years you'll have a grade which is 40% more than what you were doing when you were 12, you'd have to get your calculator out and quite a complicated Excel sheet to work out what your daughter's doing and how well she's performing. So there's no carbon index. So we have all these meetings and COP meetings, all the data, which is a bit fuzzy, but essentially the CO2 levels are still going up, and we don't have a consistent measure for which we can say to a country, hey, you need to do this, but you're only doing this, because it's just a fog of rather weird percentages.
And Matthew, I wanted to just pause on this graph, because what's striking, of course, is the juxtaposition between this accelerating line and then the list of the Conference of Parties, the COPs. Can you just talk us through the kind of historical background to the UNFCCC and their objective, which I copied from your handout, which is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level which would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system.
Yeah, well said.
No stabilization, no stabilization happening here.
Exactly. And that article 2 of the convention is almost like, are you doing it online? No, like, there's some memes that were out, you know, you had one job to do, and then you have these funny images of people who, you know, had to paint the road with turn left, and they wrote turn left, but the arrow goes right. You know, you had one job to, well, the UNFCCC has one job to do, and that's to stabilize emissions, and it's not done it. But you know, you don't get that energy from these meetings. It's always like, oh yeah, we reduced a little bit less plastic in here or something like that. So yeah. And yeah, and it's been going on for a long time like that.
I wanted to also quote you in the same report you write. It is weirdly mesmerizing that every year thousands of delegates with thousands of scientists accompanied by thousands of staff tracked by thousands of reporters all assemble in one town for 2 weeks, and the main reason for them all being there is not directly addressed or openly discussed.
Exactly. And I was in Madrid in COP 24, 25, and there were posters everywhere because of Greta and the activist movement. She was right to shift the language about climate change into catastrophe and tipping points and so on. But and there were banners everywhere with all of these, you know, it's not funny if the north, you know, if this melts, or we have desertification here. And there was information everywhere about system collapse. So that's great in terms of consciousness. But there were only 2 panels about solutions. And one of them was about eating seasonal vegetables. And the second one was about how many liters of water it costs to make a pair of jeans. And that's as you walk into COP, you are surrounded by all these panels, and those are the last 2. What are we here for?
Yeah, we're gonna get onto this, and we're gonna draw on Rahmina's also experience as a younger person experiencing it. But let's okay, tell us about the Giga Clock. Clock.
That's it. Yeah. So if you boil it down to its bare bones, and me and Rahmina were in the European School in Paris this afternoon, we are emitting at the moment 42 gigatons every year extra. So we're still pumping 42 gigatons into the atmosphere. And for 1.5 degrees, we have about 180 gigatons left. So you do the maths, we've got about 4.5 years, roughly, before 1.5 is locked in. Now, again, in the media, news, you know, the BBC, we talk about 1.5 as if it's in a way still remotely possible. Well, okay, if you're going to talk about 1.5, let's really talk about, for example, Sweden would have to cut its emissions by 27% per year from now for that. So it'd have to be carbon neutral in 4 years. It's not going to happen. Well, it could happen. I mean, so in the media, there's not this sense that because it's not underpinned by the data, therefore you get a commentary and a narrative which is not realistic. So that's what this is about. This needs updating the numbers, but because it's from 2019. But we're down to 180 now, which shows the clock is ticking. And for 2 degrees, yeah, it's about 933.
And can you just explain more precisely? Use this phrase "locked in."
Yeah.
Tell us about this time lag that is particular to carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So when you turn an oven on and you fix the temperature, it takes a while for the oven to reach that, but you're basically you're fixing it like that. So there is a lag between the CO2 going up and then the temperature actually catching up with that level of CO2. And the lag can be, well, scientists between 5-10 years. I wouldn't like to make a judgment on that as a philosophy teacher, but there's a lag. Yeah.
Thank you. And then that brings us to the current state where we are.
That's right. So there are different pathways which we're on and different commitments which countries have made. And if you want to know, if you want to get a clear idea of where we are in terms of the carbon budget and what nations have committed, then one of the Climate Academy students, Jasper, so shout out for Jasper, who's in Jokkmokk at the moment in northern Sweden, helping establish an academy. He took all the data from the Cut X% website, and he's put it into an app. So you can just download the app and you can type in a country and it will tell you what you have to do, what that country has to do for 1.5 and for 2 degrees warming to limit it at those things. So inside that app, it shows you the gap between the policy, what each government is prepared to do so far and what they would have to do too. So all the data is kind of clearly put into that phone app. And yeah, the news is that we're way off. Yeah.
Right.
Unsurprisingly.
And I thought this would be a good, I mean, this is the progression of your graphs. The sixth graph is about a responsibility. And so, of course, we're all possibly aware that the responsibility lies disproportionately on the Northern Hemisphere. Can you tell us about this map of the Earth?
Yeah. So over historically, the global north has filled the atmosphere with CO2. So but even if you ignore that and you start from now and look at the 42 gigatons which are going up every year, it's the same. It's the very high developed and the ultra high developed who are doing the most emissions. Now, again, the media tends to point the finger at China and India. So you have images of that, but they're making all the stuff that Europeans are consuming. So there's a terrible distortion of where the responsibility really is. And also on top of that, China and India have massive populations. So in a way, if you're going to divide the atmosphere per capita, which is surely the most basic move of common sense or equity, then you get numbers which are quite, they don't fit with the media narrative about who's responsible for climate change. Now, I'm not saying that India and China can burn coal, but they have a responsibility in how they produce things and their energy, of course. But the whole climate crisis is rooted in the fact that we have an overconsumption lifestyle. So in fact, the worst country, if you just zoom in on the worst country of all, it's actually Luxembourg. So sorry if you're Luxembourgish. I'm not pointing the finger at your individual life.
Yeah, and I wanted to also read it to kind of ground this in, again, a figure. So you say that it's true that China has 18.5% of the world's population, but accounts for 28% of global CO2 emissions. By contrast, the US has a mere 4.2% of the world's population and accounts for 15% of the emissions. So that kind of, I think, testifies to what you're saying.
Yeah, and this will take us to Rahmina, I think, because Kenya, without this industrial background of emissions, with infrastructure, is a fragile economy in a fragile ecosystem, and it's being just bombarded by these huge forces which are just out of its control. And you have droughts, as Rahmina will give the details, droughts in the north, floods in the west, typhoons from the east. And how is the economy supposed to withstand that, and all the social problems that come with that? So yeah, Europe, the ultra high developed, we're the ones that have to take the lead. We've got the technology, we've got the health, the wealth, we can do it.
Thank you. So Rahmina, over to you. We're going to talk about Kisumu Environmental Champs, which you founded during, I think, the first lockdown of the pandemic. So while most of us, I suppose, were at home watching television or going on a daily walk, you were founding this group. Tell us about what brought you to found this group and your experience in the early days of activism.
Well, actually, the funniest thing is that I was an environmentalist before I started this organization. So during the 2020, it was the outbreak of COVID-19, the first ever case in Kenya. So it was actually really funny. We were being told on that day when I was in school that in case there is a confirmed case of COVID, all of us will like go back home. So I thought maybe it was a joke. Then they called in the assembly and they were like, there's the first case and all schools in Kenya shut down. So you find a lot of students whenever they're back at home, they're like really alone and their parents are working or perhaps they're doing something wrong. So we had high cases of kidnappings. We had teenagers and youth using their idle time to do drugs or even to commit crimes like even theft. So I thought, what if I could be able to influence the young generation, the people who are supposed to help our future and brighten us up? So I started off with 4 of my friends, and then it became into a group where a friend was referring to a friend, family members referring to another family member, other people were interested, coming into our inbox and social media. So that's how we started off as an organization. So we are up to 200 people. We are based in different places, not only in Kisumu. We are based in Kisumu, we are based in Bungoma and other places. So it's more of other people who are coming in and trying to also give that knowledge that they have to other people across the country. So with us, we mainly do environmental conservation. We also do climate change advocacy and also awareness. So it's our main goal to work under the Sustainable Development Goals to bring back one of the most forgotten ecosystem, which is Lake Victoria. So Lake Victoria, many people back in my home and even in Kenya have witnessed the drastic changes. For example, the floods, the displacement of people, and also things like the hyacinth. So those are the things that are driving us back and saying that we need to come back to reality and fight for justice. So in 2020, I became a climate activist. From all this oppression that was bigger than the solution drove me into becoming a climate activist, seeing all these changes and also being one of the people who was a victim of the floods that happened when I was 5 years old. We had to leave the island and most of the people that I knew died. Some of my family members died. Some of the village elders died. And at least us, we got to, escape and go to the mainland. But now the problem is like whenever we speak, even climate activists, they tend to judge us a lot. Yes, we are arrogant, but why are we aggressive? It's because of the emotional trauma that we faced. If we look back at what happened, we're thinking our future lies upon our voices. And if we do not speak about it, if we do not speak about the truth, then it's like we're lying to ourselves. Like very often I find many people like commenting about how Greta is, how she's really talking her mind, angry, and even the way Vanessa is, other activists like Mitzi, also me. And I'm like, you guys don't know us on a personal level. If you get to listen to our story, you can be able to understand us and get to learn our own perspectives. We often think about the future. We also tend to indulge in the science, because science is really important and the science doesn't lie. But the fact that I am one of the people who lived in that history of the destruction is another surplus to us. So whenever I tend to give out even a message to people, I try to impart them with something that would let them get to understand and get to connect to people who are under those shoes. And I think the way Mr. Matthew Pai had already said about like how it's important to involve academics. Even right now with the education system of Kenya, they introduced the CBC curriculum. And part of this CBC curriculum, they introduced environmental studies. So children are able to learn about the environment, and they can be able to come up with different ways and techniques and technologies that they could be able to solve the climate crisis. Well, I not only think about solution, but we also think about getting to know each other, getting to connect with nature. So that's the most important part of it.
Thank you very much. I'm curious, you just said you were always an environmentalist and now you've become a climate activist. Where does that early environmentalism come from and what was that transformation like? Because I think many of us identify with feeling like environmentalists. And then, we can talk about this maybe later in the conversation. What actually happens to a person when they move from more possibly passive environmentalist to a very active activist?
Well, I became an environmentalist when I was 5 after the incident. And I also told Mr. Matipai that when I used to grow up, like even being raised, I used to ask weird questions. And those weird questions are about solving the problems in the planet. So with the interest due in from the inspiration of Wangari Maathai, the late Professor Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for defending one of the most important national park, the Uhuru Park in Kenya. So with me, I think I always had that interest in me, but I didn't know that I had it. So when this whole situation happened about the floods, it drove me into becoming more environmental conscious and wanted to solve this problem. So I started in with joining a club. After joining a club, I started with the cleanups, even growing trees, talking to young kids, and even trying to talk with adults on how we could make these solutions. At times you have to listen to your elders so that they could give you their opinion. That's why it's really important to have intergenerational dialogues, to get their views and to see how they lived on their past lives and how could that affect our future. So after that, I started doing my own projects, like using the hyacinth, which is an aquatic weed, in making eco-friendly products like cards, bookmarks, table coasters, and trying to also empower women by giving them orders so that they could make and you could sell. So the part of being an environmentalist mainly is correlating with nature and being more peaceful. Me becoming a climate activist was a whole transition. It was hard at first because seeing everything that is happening, it's quite sad since not everyone speaks about it. And since there are a lot of people who are oh, you become a climate activist, you're just making noise for everyone, but they don't listen to us, even if you make noise, even if you go to the roads. So, that's where we have a huge difference between the global north and the global south, is whenever I speak as a climate activist, I get to be called all these names criminal. And since I come from one of these segmented communities and place that is being affected by climate crisis, at the same time has corruption, has all these world problems. And I guess at one point I was actually kind of cyberbullied or maybe trolled by one of the leaders. I won't mention their names. So it's really painful that as a climate activist in Africa, we get to live under fear. And that's the huge problem. So I think for me, mixing up environmentalism and climate activism was amazing. I faced a lot of challenges, criticism, but I always say that whenever we're moving forward, we move forward. We never look back. And that's how it is.
Fantastic. And I think your testimony really kind of highlights what Matthew was, the problem that Matthew was posing at the beginning, which is how do we reconcile problems at the global level with the very local level. On the one hand, you're representing the global south, Africa, Kenya, these huge, enormous, populations and countries. On the very local level, you're dealing with Lake Victoria. And so I think your presence here and your work is somehow broaching this divide. Matthew, you mentioned the media quite a lot in your in your presentation, and we do actually have a member of the media with us. I don't know if he maybe would describe himself being involved in the media, maybe more journalism, but certainly testimony. Alister, you worked as an environmental correspondent at Reuters for 15 years. We wanted to draw on this experience to ask you, and kind of in response to what Rahmina just said, how does telling human stories, which is what you were doing for a lot of your career, help us understand this question? And what role do journalists have, and what role more broadly does journalism kind of play in this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. Rahmina, that was inspiring to hear about your experiences there. I thought I'd start off with, I don't know if you can see this rubber duck, which dates back to, I've been to 14 COPs over the years, and this was the low point of the COPs I think we went to. You gave a big history of the COPs and avoiding dangerous climate change and how close we are to breaking that limit, and inevitably we will, I think. But there was a meeting in 2005 in Montreal where the US was refusing even to talk about the long-term problem of climate change, to develop an international response. The other delegates were saying to the US delegate, please, we need to have a workshop or a non-binding dialogue, they said. But he said, no, all you're after is a treaty. All you're after is a big treaty to fight climate change, aren't you? And yeah, they were, you know, and eventually we did get one in Paris in 2015. But he said, accusing them of trying to come in by the back door with a treaty, he said, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, flaps its wings like a duck, then it is a duck. And with that, he took up all his papers and walked out of the room. So, you know, that's a personal story from within within the climate talks, perhaps. But yeah, personal stories are the way of addressing this to express the magnitude of the crisis, I think. I mean, this since that time in 2005, when the US wasn't even willing to talk about the long-term problem of climate change, it's become everything, hasn't it? I think it's become everything. You know, we look at the two huge stories of recent times, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A lot of apart from the horror of that war, a lot of the questions in Europe and around the world are how do we accelerate the transition to greener energy, or are we going to become hooked even more on this oil and gas that is causing the climate crisis? And with the COVID pandemic, of course, we were also hooked onto the, you know, how do we build back better afterwards? So yeah, I think personal stories are a very good way of attracting it. Like as you were saying, Rahmina, you know, I admire you for fighting the water hyacinth. I've even seen it on sale in European shops, which I think is an utter disgrace, because it's such a thing that grows everywhere, doesn't it? It's we really need to get rid of it. I take a bit of issue with Matthew though, because I think that it's not really the media. It's not really the media narrative that is making out like we still have time to solve this crisis. I think it's more governments that are doing that. I have the headline statements from the IPCC, the UN panel of climate experts, which is of course approved by governments, which, you know, starts off saying that, you know, there is unequivocal, beyond a shadow of doubt, evidence that we're heating the planet. But halfway down, it does say global warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. So this is, you know, the Bible of climate science, if you like. And I think that journalists would be remiss in not quoting it. And we're not making that up. And I agree with you completely that, you know, the budget for this is running out. And we are headed for, as the UN Secretary General says, we're on the highway to climate hell. You know, this is a code red emergency. Everything is at stake for us on the planet. climate change touches everything. It touches development, the economy, health, fashion, everything. And we're not, I think when you talk to climate scientists, they will sometimes say, yeah, you know, we put that in that there's still time to avert the worst if we act now, but we don't really believe it. And but it's very difficult for the media to I don't know, to say, well, they're lying to us when they say that there's still time if we cut emissions immediately right now. But going back to your question, Alice, yeah, personal stories, I think, are the best way to get into this issue. I've been lucky enough to travel to many parts of the world, and you know, one of the most memorable, I think, was going to Ghana back in 15 years ago, perhaps, to a project which was where the villagers were being paid for not exploiting the nearby forest to help biodiversity and to help protect the animals in the forest. But they said that because they weren't hunting or they weren't gathering crops or whatever from the forest, it meant that the elephant population was rising. The elephants were coming out of the forest into their land and eating their cocoa and all their other crops. So it kind of highlighted the dilemma that these people, the poor villagers had there with, the idea of protecting biodiversity and slowing deforestation at the same time that they had, they were being paid, but this was all being undermined because the elephants were thriving, which was nice.
Alister, you mentioned that story was 15 years ago. It's true that you've covered this topic for many years. And as you say, the kind of our public knowledge and consciousness about it has certainly evolved and accelerated. How has journalism and the coverage of this topic changed over the course of your career?
It's become, no, it has. I mean, journalism now, I think every story you write as a journalist, if you can write a story about the economy or about health, or there is always a climate angle to it. Even about the weather, back in when I started writing about climate change 20 years or so ago, it was always kind of, you can't attribute one individual weather event to climate change, like the heat wave in Europe in 2003, where 70,000 people died, it's estimated, many of them in France. And there was a landmark study the year after that said that global warming had at least doubled the chances of that type of extraordinary heat wave striking. So they've started to make that's become one of the biggest things, that we now link climate change to so many events, so many heat events, so many storms, so many sea level rise, for example, which I write about a lot. That all of these things are now the new normal is climate change. Climate change is at the bedrock of pretty much everything journalists write about. You can write about central bank policy and there's always going to be a climate angle. You write about oil companies and there's always a climate angle about, are they doing enough? Are they totally ignoring it? Or are they doing anything about it? You can, pretty much every story can have a climate angle to it. So I think the knowledge about climate change has spread a lot. Some news outlets, The Guardian especially, uses words like climate breakdown or global heating to try and ram home the seriousness of what's happening. Most other news outlets still use global warming or climate change fairly interchangeably, I think. But it's those sort of things are developing, that's constantly under review at a lot of places. There's no doubt that we're in a climate emergency. There are enough people saying it. And climate crisis. Climate crisis was a word that we were discouraged from using 20 years ago at Reuters. I remember having a discussion with one of the editors who said, wait a minute, your story says that seas could rise and swamp entire islands, that millions of people could be displaced. There could be more conflicts, there could be extinctions, that's going to exacerbate poverty in developing nations. It's going to exacerbate hunger. Just put in a paragraph or two about that, and that's so clearly a crisis. You don't really need to use the word. I think now these words like emergency and crisis have entered the journalism so much that we don't think about that anymore.
Thank you. You mentioned your reporting on rising sea levels, which basically made its way into, I mean, you were very humble. You said you've done a lot of work. You wrote a book about it, The Great Melt, Account from the Front Line of Climate Change. It was published 2 years ago by Flint. In the introduction, written by Cristina Figueres, who is the architect, of course, everyone knows, the Paris Agreement, she kind of commends the book, and she says, these personal stories we've been talking about are juxtaposed with the latest science to create a powerful base of evidence for urgent action to avert further suffering. Surely one tension, Alister, of course, is how does one at once create these compelling stories, but also remain true to the science and actually somehow translate the science to a general public that maybe doesn't have a kind of background in science? How do you face that challenge, which Christina said that you did very well?
I'm sorry, flattering. Here's the book. Yes, it's I tried to talk to as many people as I could. This was after I left Reuters. I went and traveled to quite a lot of places. I went to Fiji, to Panama, to and well, at Reuters I went to Antarctica a couple of times, and I did what I could to look at sea level rise from as many points of view as possible by talking to people who are living on the front lines of it, and to the scientists who are trying to research what is happening. You know, it's a really, sea level rise is such a slow motion disaster that it's kind of difficult to cover often. It's more often portrayed. People write about sea level rise when it whips up storms, when storms have become more severe because of sea level rise. You know, that the storm surges, there are floods because of more powerful storms and hurricanes and cyclones. But there are people who are, I think, being forced to move because of sea level rise. It's just like the straw that breaks the camel's back on top of all of these problems. So I visited a few places, including one in Fiji. I know we have a short video about where people have been moving inland. In fact, Prince Harry, when he visited there, British Prince Harry, when he visited there with his wife Meghan in 2018, pointed to this one village as being the first to be moved inland because of sea level rise anywhere in the world. That's, you know, debatable. Sea levels have risen by about 20 centimeters in the past century or so, and could rise another meter this century, and then, you know, goodness knows how much in coming centuries if we're unlucky.
Let's go to that video. Could you just frame it for us? I think your voice will still be heard. Oh, hello. No.
Hello. Yep. So,
Yeah. Can you just we're going to share the first video. Can you just tell us briefly what, you know, the context?
so the first video, yes, is about this is the village of Vunidogoloa in the eastern part of Fiji, where I met Simeone Botu, who is the village chief, who grew up there, but his boyhood home was right by the beach. When he showed me it, it's just a few stumps sticking out of the sand. He moved himself and his family inland a few years later, but the sea has now swamped that part of the village as well. So the whole village has now been moved more than a kilometer inland onto a hillside, where they grow the most fantastic pineapples, and everybody seems to be fairly happy with it on the surface. But surprisingly, the villagers, even though they are beneficiaries of one of the most of a total relocation of their village, they all voted for the opposition in the elections a few months after the village, a few years, sorry, in 2018, after their village was moved. They were not happy. They felt like the government had not kept all of its promises. But it's a remarkable move of an entire village by a inland by a government. There are very few examples of this. few successful examples of this happening anywhere in the world. So this is actually quite a good example, I think.
Okay, we're going to go to this good example.
This is my house.
And what happened to it?
The climate change, sea level rise, floods, cause this. So we have to shift to the new site. Okay, this is the.
That's the mark.
This is the mark.
Right up to the top of
Right
that.
up to the top here.
Yes.
Nearly went to the floor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm looking at the time and we still have to hear again from Matthew and Rahmina. So we'll just do a kind of rapid fire, a couple of questions, possibly back to you, Alister, and then open it up to audience questions. I hope that this conversation thus far has piqued your interest, certainly, but also your questions. And we'll have a lot of time, as I said at the beginning, to go to your questions, comments, to reactions, everything. So going back to the frame of education, Matthew, you note on your website and the website for the Climate Academy that the word education has its roots in the Latin word educare, which means to train, and the Latin word educare, which means to literally lead out. The Academy educates 15 to 18-year-olds. You've been running it now for many years. There are three main pillars to the Academy. There's systemic understanding, civic service, and systems entrepreneurship. Can you tell us about these three pillars and what you've learned as an educator and as the founder of the school?
Thank you. So yeah, the leading out, the first thing is you have to root it in knowledge, in the scientific understanding, a systemic understanding of things. So the Climate Academy, it deals with the physics, the biology, and the chemistry of the crisis. And then it moves into framing it very precisely with the right numbers, as with the Codex Index and so on. And then it moves on to analyze why can we not pick up on these numbers? Why do we have such an inability to grip it? And that's of course plugged into psychological, social, and paradigm problems. So that's kind of the scope of the book, which the Climate Academy starts with. So all the students start with a 6-month kind of hybrid learning thing where they read a chapter, they meet with a teacher, they develop a kind of group cohesion. And then in the second pillar, they go into do projects. So depending on their talents, depending on their drives or their interests, they then carry that systems informed thinking and the numbers into narratives which people can respond to either through podcasts or videos or events or things like that. And then the friction between those first two pillars, because whenever you try and engage people with the problem, either because it's too big or too frightening or too technical or whatever, or there's political blocks like Rahmina experienced directly, then you become a systems entrepreneur, because then you have to be creative about how you actually find leverage points and achieve systems change. So we don't teach the third pillar. It kind of happens in the second year of the academy. So it's a 2-year program. Ideally, I mean, you can do it at whatever speed you want, but that's how it functions, and it functions transdisciplinary as well, in that it's purposefully designed to not be a bit of biology or a bit of geography or something. It's a lunchtime club. Some schools have the space to actually plug it into the syllabus, but it's always something a bit like my own subject, philosophy, which is like a hub for all their diverse interests and skills and things like that.
What about the current educational system that is a kind of buffer, or let's say impervious to your education being plugged into it? What are we getting wrong in the current education system?
Well, we were getting a lot of things right 150 years ago because we had the Industrial Revolution and we needed specialized knowledge. So we designed an education system for that.
So if you could be specific, no, I mean, so also what I think that strikes me about what you just said and what I was reading about is that there's, of course, the content of the classes, as you say, there's interdisciplinary knowledge, but you've also, as you just mentioned too, you're changing the form of knowledge. It's more interactive, smaller groups, I imagine kind of seminar settings. Can you also talk about this relationship between the content of knowledge and the form that that knowledge is disseminated and discussed?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that you have to fix the right frame. You have to have key flags, or a framework to think inside. And that's what's so difficult because climate change is so wide and diverse. They need to be given a frame of reference so that they know if we're doing physics, or if we're doing sea level rises or things, that there are these basic coordinates with which I can relate to this material. So that's the first step. And that's what you don't get when you do it in another subject or you do it superficially or something. So in a way, the first move of the Climate Academy is just to establish this framework of what are these boundaries, and then that's how one of the 13th chapter of the Climate Academy is not written by me. I've done the other ones, but I outsourced that one to the European Patent Office. So they're writing that, and true innovation only can occur when you are really wrestling with the boundaries, with limits, and trying to overcome them. So that's that kind of metaphor in the 13th chapter is, in a way, what the students are doing with their lives, because it's not just knowledge, of course. As Rahmina says, you need the energy of each other. You need the spirit, the community, and the intergenerational. Sometimes we have projects with experts, and it's all in a way it spills over the edge what happens in the end with the groups. But you've got to always have the right frame of reference, and in the end that just comes down to chapter 7 and the cut X numbers. Those are just the limits. Yeah.
And one frame of reference for you, of course, is philosophy, right? So you've taught philosophy for many years. You're now rereading many of the kind of canonical philosophers, Rousseau, Nietzsche, Plato. What do we learn from philosophy when we apply an eco-environmental frame?
Yeah, I think we learn why the media struggles to deal with climate change, for example, with Plato as an example, like Alister's point about, it's not the governments, it's not the media, it's the governments. Well, of course, I'm sure Alister would agree, it's overdetermined, the crisis at every level. And Plato would say that's because in a democracy, you're always talking about freedom and choice. And what matters in a society which is embedded in fundamental values of freedom and choice is you can't deal with absolutes, you can't deal with reality. And you have a society which in a way just floats off into a kind of fake virtual world. And for Plato himself, he also had trauma as a teenager. That's quite although he's got this stony face, he's actually quite a relatable guy, because as a teenager, his teacher was executed, Socrates. The Athenians went to war with Sparta and lost catastrophically. So the Athenians, there was 18 months of the 30 tyrants where Athens was looted and abused and so on. So he went through all of those traumas, and he asked the most fundamental questions about society. And he said, yeah, we shouldn't be that proud of democracy. Well, he was not proud at all, but that same critique, I mean, I'm not anti-democratic, but you have to recognize that democracy's got limits to its functionality. And I think the climate crisis has exposed those limits. And
since we're in France, can I ask you about Rousseau?
Yeah, he was the most difficult one to write about, because he's so paradoxical. And every time you write a sentence, you can hear the opposite happening in the other half of your head saying, no, but this, but he was fantastically perceptive about the fact that although the headlines for the revolutions at the time that were happening were the toppling of the feudal system, the kings and queens, and eventually after he died, the French Revolution. He was not interested in that. He was interested in the commercial impact, like commercial society. What is commerce going to do to human psychology and to happiness? And he asked the most profound questions about what do we mean by progress? And the French at the time, well, he's Swiss, but at the time they could see in a mirror the North American, the Indians, and most people in a way laughed at the Native American, there was this kind of European, well, eventually genocide, but European high ground with these native cultures. And he was the only voice really in the Enlightenment to say, well, I think we lost something that they understand about community, about nature, about he has this beautiful phrase, he has these lots of beautiful phrases, but one of them is that humans should learn to live in themselves, not in the opinions of other people. And he could just see a society that was becoming hyperventilating on other people's opinion of themselves. And the mobile phone is like the ultimate Rousseauian proof of what he could see. Yeah.
Thank you for that, because it's actually a really great transition back to Rahmina, because I wanted to ask you, Rahmina, two questions. One is that you mentioned your use of social media as a platform, but also, of course, the dark side of social media, as you mentioned, cyberbullying. We're talking about media, we're talking about journalism, we're in partnership with News Decoder. Social media platforms can spread the word, but they can also be sites of disinformation, and especially when we've talked about how the science and very correct science is so important here. How do you balance your use of social media for the better or for the worse? And I know that you're on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, and maybe you're not on Facebook because you're too young and too cool, but tell us about or maybe you are.
Yes, I'm on Facebook, and my mom is the one who's handling it. Yeah, so I get a lot of help from her.
And can you talk about this double-edged sword of social media?
Okay, first of all, yes, you've said a good point. Social media has a lot of misinformation, and it depends on the people who are carrying this information, if they will spread it or rather research it. So even I think there was one time I was scrolling through my Instagram, and I saw one of the things that Prince William said about like Africa being one of the regions that the ones who are endangering the wildlife species, like for example the elephants. And I was like I was really shocked, because even with you see this culture, the Maasai people, I think they're really, really famous, and you might know them. The Maasai tribe, they live within, the natural ecosystem with wildlife animals, and they even protect them. So that's just one of the things that I wanted just to point out. Then I think with social media, it has two sides. First, it has a positive side where you'll be able to reach out to people. You talk about different topics, be it on gender equality, be it on climate crisis, be it on environmental, or even something that, that requires about the talent and self-driven things, for example, entrepreneurship. But the dark side is, first of all, with the cyberbullying thing. Second of all, is being shadow banned. So there's a way your content is not being displayed outside. And more of the time, we usually count on, we hold accountability to the social media companies, because they're the ones who are shadow banning us, not us. So whenever we have this critical information that we want to pass on, let's say, for example, to a leader, or we're trying to expose something that is happening, you'll find that your content is not moving. And that is because of being shadow banning. Like even outside social media, you find a lot of the times climate activists speak and stuff, but they're kept under a stage where they cannot give out some information. Like, for example, African activists and even Asian activists, there's some things that we do not say because you're putting our lives at risk. So that's also another part of it. Then I think with social media too, it drives you kind of insane at times when you misuse it, you know. At times even I just work on my social life behind social media. I like take some break from social media because you also need time to relax and rethink about your life and also think about what are you going to do next. You see?
This is what I wanted to ask you next, because you know, you said you started as an environmentalist, very young age. Now you're a climate activist. I mean, from what you've described and everything that you've told us this evening, it is a very intense process to be engaged in. I mean, you're traveling all over the world. People are commenting on you for positive or negative. Do you continue as you look? I mean, you're very young.
Yeah, I am.
You have many years ahead. This is an ongoing conversation. Do you think that you'll continue to be an activist? Do you think that you might take a step back, or how might your engagement with this issue evolve? And what advice would you give to any activists who are, as you say, really putting their lives on the line oftentimes?
Well, I'd like to come back to the social media part. With social media, I think a lot of climate activists and even climate educators, like for example, I like to shout out to some of the most influential ones on that are using the social media, like Mitzi Jonelle, Nikki Becker, Nyombi, Morris. They are always trying to use the social media for good thing, but what we normally don't get, like with the climate activists, like we would like even the social media, you know, companies, the ones like Instagram, TikTok or something, to kind of verify all climate activists or have something for the verification to make it easier for them to be notable. Or even they like post what they are doing and what they are trying to bring in, the narratives, on their own social media page. You find that a lot of times all these TikTok dancers, you know, these people who rap or even someone who just creates something, most of the times the content is being pushed by the own social media company. So if they could back up the climate activists and environmentalists. So second of all, what you were asking about the climate activists who are putting their life on the line. Well, I'm also putting my life on the line, but with us, the main problem is like we don't have the power and we don't have the resources to protect ourselves. So let's say there's a problem in our family and, you know, they are like kind of multinational companies who are sending us threats, or even the government. We cannot talk about it on social media. And since we are the ones who are actually going to bear the consequences, it's like us putting ourselves, you know, burying ourselves alive. So if we could get that support legally and even financially, and also help with the help of diplomats, so that in case of anything happens, we can be able to get that refuge. Like even being climate refugees, I hear my friends talk a lot, the ones from Pakistan, the ones from Palestine, the one from different places. And when I listen to the story, I feel really motivated, you know, as much as it's painful, but you feel motivated. You're like, I want to do more. But I also connect with it. That is the problem. So if we could also have a way that organizations and people could say, oh, let's come and partner up together. We give you this amount of money, you do it on a climate project, and you give out this content. That would be really amazing, because these climate activists are actually suffering. Not that we're coming from high income family. Most of us are struggling. Our parents are single mothers, parents are single fathers, and we don't normally share it on social media or with other people. So if we could come in with that. So my main message to people is that just be yourself. Try to help out in any other way. Do not kill yourself because of something, but try to find the beauty within this negative side of the earth. And one thing that I'd like to tell, most especially the younger generation, is that a lot of us are under negative peer pressure, including the teenagers. And it's not a good thing to be part of, but that's how life is. So if they could choose their own path and know their purpose, it would be great to be one of the people who are the leaders of tomorrow and the change makers.
Thank you, Rahmina. We have a round of applause, please. There are no more questions, but we promised you lots of time for your questions. So we will turn to the audience. I will pass the mic over to Emily and she'll come in. Any questions? Yes.
Thanks very much. Question of Mr. Pai, if I may. If governments have failed to get a grip on the problem through many COP meetings, what are our responsibilities as citizens, as individuals?
Yeah, I think I'd like to come back to what Rahmina was just saying about the powerlessness of what they can, you know, at the very minimum, the media and has to be holding our governments to account about what we are doing. I mean, of course, in a way, I'm not going to even repeat any of the, let's say, tropes about individual actions reducing, because that's been said a zillion times. We have a responsibility to make it clear who is emitting now, where is it coming from? And that's just not clear. And the numbers have to be put out there. You know, it's just not funny. Kenya could increase its emissions by 1.1% and we'd still be consistent with 2 degrees. So just like Rahmina can't do anything from inside Kenya, we need in Europe and in the ultra high developed nations to just put on the table exactly who is doing it. And without that accountability, Greta talks quite rightly about holding governments to account, hold them against the wall, but you can't do that if you don't have a clear measure to be able to do it. So I think the central goal of the Climate Academy is simply to inform students and enable them to go into the democratic space, to hold and sustain a clear narrative about it, where things are just backed up by science and there's a just clear accountability with numbers. So I know that's in a way a partial, I mean, where do I stop in terms of what we could do? But I think that's a key thing which is missing. And I don't think, I really disagree with Alister saying that it's all about narrative. Okay, you need narrative stories, but we didn't cover COVID only with narrative stories. We also covered it with the data about how many people were in hospitals and how many were dying. It's not a contradiction. And we are not doing the data. And we're not doing it for all kinds of reasons. Media is owned by multinational. It's a whole matrix of forces, psychological, social, economic. But we have to support people like Rahmina by holding governments to account on their emissions, and that it has to be equitable.
Alister, maybe we can go to you just to kind of flesh out Nelson's question, because something you wanted to point out was that for you, this is also a crisis of climate diplomacy. Can you talk about that and maybe respond to what we've been saying to you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean that talking about individuals' stories are a way of hiding the data in any way. I think it's just a way of making it more accessible for people to understand some of this data. I mean, yes. I mean, there is not enough focus on data. I mean, if the Americans are talking about halving their emissions this decade, as Joe Biden does, those emissions will still be higher in 2030 than the average European. So, you know, the Qatari emissions are the highest in the world, I think at about 60 tons per person. You know, the world average is 4 or 5, isn't it? We've got to, so places like Kenya are, as you say, can easily raise them. We just have to put more focus upon the entire problem here, don't we? And I think it is up to governments it's to set the to set the path for this. We can't, you know, as Al Gore sometimes says, you know, if you want the best action on climate change, write to your senator, write to your congressman, use your vote to achieve this. Put pressure on politicians to do this. They hold the big levers. You know, I can become a vegan tomorrow. I've bought an electric car. We have a heat pump in our house here, but these are just toying around the edges, aren't they? With the big problem, we need to have a systemic change, as everybody's saying.
Maybe we can hear also about your experiences at the COPs. I mean, as citizens at the COPs, because you both were talking about kind of how ridiculous it was and what's it actually like for those of us who watch the coverage of it, hear about it. What's it like to be there? What's the feeling in the air? What are the emotions? Yeah.
With the first ever COP that I attended was COP26, but the second was COP27. With COP26, I think there was a lot of frustration, first of all, with getting the finances as a climate activist. I'm speaking in general, in getting a place to stay, in getting support, like every day. Then another problem is like the lack of inclusivity at these conferences. So when I was in COP26, I realized that there were a lot of people. There are a lot of, and it's quite known. There are a lot of people from the fossil fuel industry who are making presence. And it was determined that there were like more than 400 people over there. And you can imagine how many leaders were there. So even from my own observation in COP27, in the one that happened in Egypt, there are a lot of African leaders who are coming in with their own bodyguards, 6 to 7 bodyguards. They had all these assistants. And I was like, you don't need to have that, There is even some leaders who, like, no one even cares about the leaders. We are all going there with one common goal. And the problem is like, we are all talking about the crisis, but they're all foiling the crisis. They're all having this kind of setup where they have these companies that they have that are actually contributing to the climate crisis. And they both speak at the high level table, speaking how it's important to address loss and damage, it's important to address climate crisis, it's important to include young voices, the youths, in terms of policy making, but then they have a setback. And that's towards their investments. Where are they lying the investments? If we're speaking about the climate crisis, we're also speaking about the finance, because that is the most important part. The loss and damage finance was agreed upon after all those fights that we did, the intense fight that we did the whole year and even the previous year, that came to a success. But we're still trying to look at if this loss and damage finance will be delivered and how will it be issued and how will it be accessible for the ones who need it the most, who are supposed to work on these projects. So even within our systems, the reason why I usually support like uproot the system, but what I usually say, if you can't change the system, be in the system and change the system. So even within the system, there's a way that it has been structured that all these investments are going towards the pockets of the government, the pockets of the leaders. They give it to their family, but they keep on forgetting the ones who are suffering the most from it. So even with the COPs, I usually get disgusted when leaders pretend to like take pictures with youths and would like use it as a way of tokenism. Today we were with these youth, spoke about the climate crisis, looking at the youth, 2030 agenda, but then you don't look forward and say, where is the bigger picture over there? You're just only taking a picture, doing a conversation. We want the real thing. Even with the Children Youth Pavilion, which is the first ever Children Youth Pavilion, it was amazing that was there, but there are a lot of stranded youths and children who are just there. They're just sitting there doing nothing. So even with me, I was really disappointed that yes, there are some who've been privileged to come over here and fight for change, but why are they stagnant? Why are there no involvement? Even when you're speaking about being at a high level table, the ones who have connections are the ones who get to access it. Even when you look at the COP27, not many people came. Even with some of the leaders were absent in most of the times. So that shows you how people are like trying to change their ways, and they are kind of ignorant. Even, I mean, with the COP28, the president of the COP28 is one of the hugest funder of some fossil fuel companies, which is quite sad because you're fighting fossil fuel, but he's there. So it's like all of us who are going to, like the young people who are going to COP are just going there to fight for policy change making, but there's nothing being implemented. It's like all of us are like water, and the leaders, the government are these the sponge. So we're being sucked in.
A great metaphor. More.
Hello. In the past decade, we've seen a lot of companies say that they're going green or that they're carbon neutral. What exactly do those statements mean? And are they just smoke and mirrors and posturing? And are those statements something that's actually feasible? For example, I think it was John Oliver did an episode about those companies saying how dishonest that is and how misleading that is for the public.
Yeah, I also saw that episode. Yeah, I think there's a million ways in which capitalism or corporations have of dodging the problem and getting around it. BP invented the notion of the individual carbon footprint, which we've all been walking with in our own individual ways. So the matrix of how we think and everything, and these latest things are just the same. And the whole notion of like carbon neutrality by 2050. Well, why 2050? You know, put it on the carbon budget. That's what you have to do. I mean, don't invent a date from nowhere. So all of that has to just be informed by carbon budgets. And on top of that, I think we also have to ask the deeper question, and this is of course too big to handle here and now, but like what Rousseau asked about, what is the human condition? What are we trying to do here? You know, we are not driven by material. We're not satisfied by material wants, and we want resonance in our lives. We want community, we want nature, we want meaning, we want projects, and the whole corporate machinery just keeps reinventing itself to be able to dodge the bullet about the fact that that is just the deepest illusion of all.
To add on his point, I think this is just one thing that I'd like to give out this information to you guys. Well, actually, the greenwashing scheme from these big companies is becoming more advanced, that they're even luring climate change activists and environmentalists to be part of, their adverts and be like, this is what they are achieving and this is what they want to achieve in the next couple of years. So even we've had some climate activists speaking, should I take this or should I not take this? So most of the times whenever we also speak about media, that's why media has a big role to play. Like we have to think of what to accept and what not to accept. Even within the whole structure of this greenwashing, it's everywhere. Even some organizations that are environmental organizations, they keep on saying they're doing this, but when you look at how this money gets to them, it's all about, the profits. Like even right now, apart from greenwashing, I'm wondering that, are we going to trade the earth at this point? Because everyone is running for the profits. And that's what is making us to go back. So that's the real question. Are we trading the earth? Because if you're trading the earth, then that means it's on market. If our land is on market, our forest is on market, and they're advertising everyone in big television screens. They're advertising everywhere with all these models, with all these people who look nice, with all these clothes, and even with the fast fashion, they are known to do that. So even with us as climate activists and environmentalists, we try as much as possible to stop greenwashing. And whenever we have these organizations that approach us, we try to do a check back on what they are, who they are, how is their investment scheme, and what are they intending to give back to the society.
Any other questions in the room? Yes.
Hey folks, my name is JP. I just want to firstly thank the three of you for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm actually surprised that the elephant in the room was only just mentioned. The word capitalism was not mentioned until just now. And I was surprised because this session was what is climate change? And we started with why do we have climate change, right? And at the end of the day, we keep talking a lot about systemic change. We have to change the system, right? Well, what is the system? The system that we live in is predominantly westernized capitalism, right? And capitalism is not natural, right? And I'm sorry, Alister, but I do have to agree that the Western media has entirely been complicit in pushing the capitalist agenda, right? Saying that more is better, individualization is better. And this has caused essentially an unprecedented acceleration in the last 50 years. That isn't natural. It's not natural. Matthew was saying it's not natural for humans to be individualized. It's natural for us to be communal, convivial. It's natural for us to want to be with other people, to be in connection with nature, to want to give, to share. It's not natural to want to accumulate, to want to hoard, to want to have it all and not let the others have it because I worked hard for it, etc. And this is just the message really that we get, right? That you have to work hard and you have earned it, and these billionaires, etc., deserve it. But at the end of the day, that is really what is fueling the climate crisis, right? The richest 10% of individuals emit 50% of all emissions. The richest 10 billionaires emit 8,000 times than the poorest 1 billion individuals on this planet. Fact check me. This just came out by Oxfam 2 weeks ago. And so I'm curious, sorry, I rant, but the question is, at the end of the day, do you folks see capitalism or our system being compatible with a livable, sustainable, fair, and equitable future? Yeah.
No. No, capitalism is, as you say, yeah, it's yeah, that's the one. I'm writing chapter 6 at the moment of the Climate Academy textbook, and it's all about India in the 19th century and how that was just basically taken over by the East India Company, which is Google with guns. And yeah, there was mass starvation, 30 million people. Why? Because the algorithm of how decision and policy making just became all about profit. And that was the 19th century. And what's happened since then is just got deeper. So yeah, capitalism is is driving it. This is the Capitalocene, or the, and it's too general to say it's the Anthropocene. It's the Capitalocene, or it's the Klepocene, or it's the theft of Rahmina's future by yeah. It's those are the dirty truths, and we have to be honest about it. And as you say, students know it as well. This is not like some radical. I once got given a present as for a teacher. You get bottles of wine at the end of the year. Once a student gave me a watermelon, red on, green on the outside, deep red in the middle, as if I'm some sort of Marxist. And I'm not wearing the red jumper from that, but you don't. Yeah, but Marx was just a critique of capital. I mean, it is the problem, and it's a problem of imagination in a way. We can't imagine what is beyond capitalism. And there's no answer to that, but we just have to try. We have to put young children, young people in a place where they start improvising with systems entrepreneurship, and then they taste what it's like. So this thing has to emerge. All systems come from simplicity, and then you get so let's get down to the simple basics and let's see what emerges as a rival, if you like. Otherwise, as Marx predicted, capitalism will self-destruct.
Alister, we'd love for you to respond.
I certainly don't think the media are complicit in this. And I agree with you that it's very, very difficult to see how we're going to get from capitalism to a system where everybody in the world has a fair shot at a life. We're not on track for that in the absolute slightest. But, media are not activists either, are we? I mean, we're also reporting on what people say. I mean, Joe Biden, look at what his policies are. He says when he thinks of the environment, some people say this is going to mean economic straitjackets and so on, as George Bush used to say, or Donald Trump would say. He says when he hears the words green growth, he hears the words jobs, 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 and that the world does not going to have to reduce their economic well-being, that there could be a rising tide for everybody. Capitalism I find very hard to reconcile with this, but what are you going to do about it? Are you going to smash the system? I agree completely. We need to change the way the world works to give developing countries a fair shot at this. But I can't see how we're going to do that. And I don't think that the media are complicit in creating a false narrative about this.
I wanted to ask a personal question to Rahmina, but just to give like the background of where I'm coming from. Timothy Morton, he explains the whole concept of interconnectedness, and that some people, only some, unfortunately, recognize the interconnectedness that we have in our society, in our world. And so it's just how it is that some people are able to recognize and connect the dots of, climate crisis and societal crisis, all of the crises combined. And I was wondering, when you mentioned that you gathered, like your friends and then the friends of the friends, and thinking about what happened to you in the childhood, are there still people in your environment that, even though they experience the same thing as you, they still are unable to connect the dots, or maybe they refuse, and maybe they are even like anti-activists?
Whoa, there are a lot of anti-activists in my place, but I always say that I do my thing. So yeah, well, yes, we still have some people who are really ignorant and they don't want to listen. So the ones who, you could see that majority of them are from the poor communities. And since they're chasing to get the bag, to get money for their food, to get money for the school fees of their children, they're coming from a place that has low income. Someone might earn $2 in a month. And you still want to tell them about the climate crisis, and they're facing it. They will tell you, between you coming and telling me that, could you give me money? And I take my child to school. So those are the questions whenever I get asked, I first think, because it's a lot to consume in. And the fact that it's also involving economy, it's a great question that really remains a mystery. So with us, we are trying to do more sensitization in the communities, but you still have this percentage of people who do not understand. They understand, they have faced the same thing that I have faced, but they're vulnerable. They cannot do anything. So what the best that they could do is blame on the government. And what they normally say is that, why should I defend myself if I could just go to Coca-Cola, or I could go to any other company, or I could go to a fossil fuel industry like Shell and work for them? So those are the most imposing questions that I normally get with those who are like anti-activists like me. Like they don't like activists like me. So whenever they come to me, some of them even are professors who are not like poor, but there's some segment of people who are like professors and lecturers. They've gotten these degrees, they've gotten these masters, but they normally ask me, why not go to school? Why are you focusing on this? Life has to go on. You'll die at some point. So those are the types of things that normally, when a girl like me, I'm still 17, I'm still growing up, I'm not a grown-up. So whenever we listen to such hurtful words, it breaks us down. But with me, I change it into a positivity. I say, I could just tell these young kids to grow up and be who they are and to not stop from what they're doing. Even with the poor people, we're trying to organize a way that, especially the women, because they're the ones who normally have that kind of thought. We're trying to organize a way that they could be able to empower themselves and to have promote the blue economy by selling the products of hyacinth. So that's how they've started understanding, and they're saying, oh, then I could actually earn money through doing something that is more sustainable. And that's how we have tried to change most of their mindsets. But there's some that still have the same attitude, and it's will take a long time for them to accept the fact that we're living in a crisis and we need to do something.